Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to draw a straight line from a modern, app-based gig contract right back to a violent 1919 streetcar protest, tracing the massive pendulum swing between conflict and compromise in Canadian labor history. So let's kick things off with a pretty wild question. How exactly do the rights of an Uber driver today rely on rules that were literally written in blood over a century ago? You see, when a rideshare driver secures a new collective agreement, right now, you aren't just looking at an app update. You're actually watching the newest chapter in a 100-year struggle for legitimacy, recognition, and basic rights. To really get how we got here, we got to rewind the clock.
Okay, so here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with early struggles and strikes, then move into the post-war labor compromise. After that, we'll look at the rise of the public sector, followed by the public-private union divide, and finally, organizing the gig economy.
Let's dive right into part one, early struggles and strikes, the fight for legitimacy.
Picture this. It's the early 20th century. Unions don't really have legal standing, and if you go on strike, you're probably facing a brutal state crackdown. World War I has just caused massive inflation, completely eating away at the wages of everyday workers. Soldiers are coming home to high unemployment, and bosses are tightening their grip. Well, all that frustration boiled over on May 15th, 1919. 30,000 workers, union and non-union alike, just walked off the job in Winnipeg. They brought the entire city to an absolute standstill. But business and government leaders, they weren't having it. They coordinated a massive effort to crush the strike, culminating on June 21st. We now call it Bloody Saturday because the Northwest Mounted Police actually fired into the crowd, killing 2 strikers. The strike was broken, yeah, but it set the stage for a much larger, highly organized labor force in the decades to come.
Which brings us to part 2, the post-war labor compromise, writing the rules. Jump ahead to the summer of 1943. At this point, 1 in 3 Canadian union members are on strike illegally, and mostly, they just wanted companies to admit they existed. The government is terrified that wartime production is going to completely collapse, so in 1944, they roll out Privy Council Order 1003. Now, if you compare this to the American Wagner Act, the Canadian law baked in a very specific, strict trade-off. Employers legally had to recognize unions and bargain with them, but in exchange, workers were explicitly banned from striking while a collective agreement was active. It was basically a forced compromise to guarantee industrial peace.
And that brings us to 1946 and something called the Rand Formula. This was an absolutely crucial judicial decision by Justice Ivan Rand, meant to end a huge strike at a Ford plant in Windsor. His logic was pretty straightforward. Since everybody in a workplace benefits from the higher wages and protections that a union negotiates, well, everybody should chip in to cover the union's costs, so the employer just deducts the dues automatically. No freeloaders allowed. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. To get that financial security, unions had to strictly police their own members and ensure absolutely no wildcat strikes happened. This right here became the bedrock of modern Canadian industrial relations.
All right, part 3, rise of the public sector, a new kind of militancy.
Up until the 1960s, public sector workers belonged to these associations that were, frankly, kind of powerless. They couldn't bargain, and they definitely couldn't strike. But in 1965, facing terrible conditions, stagnant wages, and super authoritarian bosses, postal workers just said enough and walked out illegally. They totally forced the government's hand. This massive disruption led directly to the 1967 Public Service Staff Relations Act, making Canada only the 3rd country in the entire world to actually allow public sector strikes. It completely changed the game.
To give you an idea of just how much leverage these newly organized workers had, look at the massive 6-week postal strike in 1975. The post office handled pretty much all physical communication and payments back then, so when they struck, the impact was devastating. Businesses couldn't bill their clients, which led to massive internal cash flow crises. Companies literally had to take out huge loans just to keep the lights on. It got so crazy that thousands of Canadians were driving across the border to post offices in places like Buffalo and Niagara Falls just to mail their letters. This whole era completely cemented the immense power of the public sector union.
Now let's look at part 4, the public-private union divide, a tale of 2 sectors. By 2023, we're seeing a massive gap between the two. Nearly 77% of public sector workers, so your teachers, nurses, civil servants, are unionized, but over in the private sector, union density has just plummeted, sitting all the way down at 15.5%. That means a public sector worker is nearly 5 times as likely to be covered by a collective agreement. A lot of this decline was driven by huge shifts in the economy, like the shrinking of the manufacturing industry, which used to be the absolute stronghold for private sector unions,
But here's why this matters in a broader context. Even though Canada's private sector union density has basically halved since the 1980s, our overall union density still sits around 30%. That is way more robust than the United States, where overall density has dropped down to about 10%. So why the difference? It's exactly because of that massive, highly organized public sector foundation we just talked about. It keeps the Canadian labor movement historically resilient. But it does leave millions of modern private sector workers, especially those in new, precarious gig jobs, totally without traditional protections. Which leads us to our final chapter, Part 5, Organizing the Gig Economy, the New Frontier.
For years, platform companies argued that their workers were just independent contractors. You know the drill. No minimum wage, no overtime, no union rights. But then, British Columbia tweaked its labor laws to create a specific classification for platform workers, effectively removing that massive legal hurdle. Once that door was open, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union stepped right in, organized app-based drivers in Victoria, and actually ratified Canada's first ever legally enforceable app-based collective agreement.
They proved that under the right circumstances, app-based work can indeed be union work. This is a huge breakthrough. It shows that collective bargaining is flexible enough to adapt to the gig economy. Think about it. This brings a century-old fight for legitimacy straight into the digital age. This new contract gets drivers a wellness fund and real face-to-face representation if they get arbitrarily deactivated by an algorithm. But more profoundly, it proves that the legacy of the RAND formula, the idea that workers can trade stability for baseline dignity, can absolutely be applied to the algorithmic management of the 21st century.
So I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. As platform work continues to expand, could these new gig contracts be the spark that ignites a larger resurgence for Canada's private sector labor movement? From the chaotic streets of Winnipeg back in 1919 to the digital dispatch algorithms we use today, the tools of the trade have completely changed. But the fundamental questions about power, peace, and protection, they remain exactly the same. Thanks so much for joining this explainer. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we'll see you next time.